There are stories I had meant to keep quietly to myself, the kind that sit like stones in your pocket. If you shake them, they jingle and someone might hear. If you stay until the end, I hope you will hear what I needed most to say. If this finds you curious, stay a little while, subscribe, like, and follow for more true-to-life stories. It helps more than you know and keeps these stories breathing. The call came while I sat in a plastic chair beneath a poster about cholesterol and walking. The clinic smelled of lemon disinfectant and the stale coffee of other people's waiting. I had folded the magazine in my lap because the crossword was too hard and the small print made my eyes ache. The phone vibrated in my bag like an insect. When I looked, the screen said Angela, and the sound of her voice on the line felt like cold hands. "Mom," she said, as if speaking to any stranger. "Tomorrow we're off. The moving truck is at noon." I laughed at first, the kind of nervous sound that is middle-aged and brittle. "Off where?" "To Florida. To the beach house. Edward arranged the transfer. Her voice thinned. "He signed everything. We closed. We sold it, Mom. They wired the rest today. I'm so relieved." Relieved. The word landed and ruptured the calm I had been practicing for 20 years. The beach house had been Robert's. He had built it with his hands and his stubborn, slow-saving nature. A porch with one loose board where his morning paper always stayed crooked. A kitchen tile with a chip that matched the small dent in the cast-iron skillet he would never throw away. It was a place of light and sand and the smell of salt that stuck to your hair. Robert had died 5 winters ago, with the radio at low volume and my hand in his. And after the funeral, I kept going back to the porch as if it were a threshold to the better parts of our life. "Angela," I said slowly, listening to the other mothers, men, and old women in the room breathing around me. "What do you mean they sold it? You can't sell the beach house, the title." "It was just paperwork, Mom. Edward had everything in order. He said it was messy with the estate. He said we'd be stuck forever with maintenance and taxes. He said we could get cash now. We need it. I need it. God knows I need it." Her voice revealed nothing of how need had come to be measured. I hung up and pretended to read the crossword for the rest of my wait. My hand felt heavier than usual. Later, at home, the house felt like it had shrunk without the idea of that porch there to make it breathe. I thought of the truck Robert had kept under a tarp, old with the smell of motor oil and peppermint gum, and the faded beach towel in the drawer with a lobster embroidered on it. Angry felt too sharp. I was tired, and something like grief folded itself into my patience. 2 days later, when she left, it happened with the casual cruelty of a farewell that wanted no witnesses. She kissed my cheek, soft enough to be forgiven at first glance. Then she stacked 3 boxes in the hallway like a barricade between our years. "Mom, you've been so dramatic about this," she told me, rolling her eyes. "You'll be fine here. Aunt Liza loves company. Don't worry, we're taking the truck. It's better for us near the coast." She had looped Edward's arm like a victory flag. He looked like the glossy photographs in the real estate pamphlets. Smile inked in charm, hair combed to the right amount of disorder. The house felt heavier after she left, as if someone had closed a window and sealed off the smell of summer. I went to the drawer where I kept the keys to the safety deposit box Robert had insisted we open 5 years before he went into the hospital. I had the key for our box, numbered on a thin red tag, 247. I had always felt silly about it, paranoia, Robert had called it. But when money had to be moved in the estate, the bank had joked at how meticulous he had been. I had never opened it. The envelope with his handwriting sat in a different drawer, the manila edges browned like old leaves. It was then, after the moving truck had disappeared down the street and the letter of sale had been filed with signatures that did not look like my Robert's, that I opened the manila envelope. Inside were two things: a folded page with Robert's calm script and a small brass key marked 247. The letter began in a voice I remembered rode with domestic detail and half-jokes, with the kind of affection that always made me feel safe. If anything happens to me, Antonia, don't let them rush you. Read everything twice. Trust your hands. I sat with the paper on my knees and felt the slow, hot flare of something like hope. The paper listed accounts, a note about a small collection of jewels he'd insisted on keeping safe, and instructions. In the safety deposit box, you'll find deeds and a list. Keep calm. Call Peterson only if you must. He is discreet. Robert had always liked his neatness like religion. There was a line I didn't understand at first that said, "I know Angela won't heed me, but she will learn what she must. You have my blessing." My fingers trembled. He had left me a plan in case life turned cruel in the hands of those who loved him least. It felt like a small private providence. I wanted to drive to the bank right away. I wanted to take the key, throw open the deposit box, and drag out paper proof and present it like law. Instead, I sat at the kitchen table with coffee and cream and watched the sunlight on the dented kettle. I wasn't a young woman anymore. I had learned to measure my moves like Robert's ledger, one decisive entry at a time. Mr. Peterson's office smelled of wood and leather and something faintly citrus, books older than his business card. He had called back when I left his message, and his voice when we met was the tone of someone who had been given both trust and trouble often enough to know how to carry them. He asked for no details at first. He simply listened, which felt like being handed an ally. At his request, I described the sale, Angela's signature, Edward's name on the closing papers. He nodded, the way a good lawyer does, and then he tilted his head. "Forged signatures happen," he said, the sentence as blunt as a scalpel. "But they can be undone if you can provide clear evidence they didn't have authority. Security video, bank transfers, contradictory documents. Do you have any of Robert's documents that weren't discussed at the closing?" I slid the manila envelope across the desk. He handled the paper with care, like a thing that could sting. He read Robert's names and the small list he had tucked away. "This is an instruction," he said finally, "and this key." He turned the brass key over thoughtfully on the oak. If Robert anticipated trouble, he may have accounted for it in those deeds. It's not common, but it's not unheard of. We'll need to be strategic. Fraud is a messy thing because it involves people who pretend to be honest. "Peterson," I said, the name tasting like something formal. "Angela signed the closing, but her signature, it isn't my Angela's. It is slanted differently. She was always messy with paperwork." There was a small private sorrow that I could not hide from him, a daughter's handwriting that had learned to draw tidy lies. He did not look at me as if I was wrong to be angry. That was what I liked about men like him. They were not swept by drama. They offered processes, which are comfort enough. He requested copies of everything Robert had left, and he wanted me to keep the existence of the box quiet while he made inquiries. "No sudden calls to her," he advised. "Let us build a case that is clean and then present it with no more harm than necessary." For a week, I kept up appearances. I went to the market, I mended a sleeve, I watched the little television weather forecasts, and pretended that my calendar's empty squares were a kind of relief. Neighbors came and left casseroles. Aurora, who lived next door with a yard of potted geraniums and a voice like a radio soap, brought me lemon bars and the town gossip. "I ran into Angela at Petunia's," she said, sitting at my kitchen table like an uninvited truth. "She looked radiant with that beach air about her. Said life was finally easy. Said she couldn't believe we were living here still." Aurora tapped her fingers on her knee and looked at me with a mixture of curiosity and pity. "People move for reasons they believe strong," I said. "They're good at convincing themselves."
She laughed, but then, as women will, she offered me a half-firm, half-soft counsel. "If you need anything, Antonia, I'm here." What I needed was to see the box. It was a small ritual at the bank.
The vault was cool and smelled like metal and old paper. The attendant walked with the measured steps of one who has held secrets before. Inside box 247, among the usual receipts and the brittle receipts of life, lay the deeds to the beach house, a couple of letters from contractors, and a small velvet pouch with 2 necklaces Robert had insisted on keeping. The deeds had Robert's name, my name, and a third document that made my chest tighten, a power of attorney, notarized 5 years earlier with language that allowed for trusteeship in case of incapacity. Robert had been thinking ahead in a way that made my throat both proud and heavy. Mr. Peterson's inquiry moved in small increments. He called banks, he summoned records, he compared signatures. He found a deposit from the sale that went into an account with Edward's name and another transfer that credited a down payment into which a third party had been co-signed. "There are red flags," he said one evening over a cup of coffee in my kitchen, "but red flags can be papered over with friendly words." Angela called occasionally, the calls short and practical. Once she asked if I had the beach towels. Once she said, "Don't be dramatic, Mom, we needed to move." She worried about her hair and the neighbor she'd now be closer to. She worried about nothing I considered urgent, but her voice, the way her tone slid from impatience to brittle performance, made me think of the child who had once left her shoes in the middle of the living room and wept when they were nowhere to be found. I sat with Robert's jewels in my hands that night, the small velvet pouch warm as if held. The stones were not as valuable, in the way the world counts value, as some people might have guessed. They were sentimental, inherited from a mother's watch. But the paperwork in the deposit box suggested other sources of liquidity Robert had quietly accrued. An extra sum tucked away in a trust, a series of dividend statements he had never shown me, thinking perhaps they'd be dull comforts for later. He had played the long game, and when Edward and Angela had rushed to cash in immediacies, Robert's patience began to look like providence. I tried to move with prudence. I kept the house in order. I wrote thank you notes for casseroles. But I also accepted Mr. Peterson's counsel. Let the law move in its pace while I did mine in the spaces between. His investigations revealed small, ugly things, documentation forged with a clarity that betrayed practice, not accident, a notary who had been paid under a pseudonym, a paper that bore a signature that had been traced. He told me enough to make my resolve a cold iron, and not enough to gloat. Angela's reckoning came with domestic consequences rather than spectacular ruin. Edward's business partners withdrew when his transfers came under scrutiny. The money that had seemed to flow freely became a drip. The mortgage company for the apartment where they had moved issued a 30-day notice when Edward couldn't meet a call on a line of credit. The moving truck that had gleamed in their driveway went back to the rental company with the back doors slamming shut, and no one quite willing to say why. She called one evening from a payphone near a mall, voice raw. "They've cut the electricity," she said. There was a new sound in her voice then, a jaggedness that came after the vanity had been stripped. "I don't know what to do. Edward says—" What I told her was careful. I gave her neither the charity of immediate rescue nor the cruelty of abandonment. "Come back," I said. "There's a room. We'll figure something out." She came back with a small suitcase and the leftover confidence of someone who had been taught to believe the world owed her. She slept in the spare room and ate the leftover casserole I had frozen. When she filled the dishwasher, she did it with an exactness that spoke of shame and unfamiliarity at being small, of having to be careful. I watched her move with a distance that felt like observant study. It was not only to protect my property, but to let her meet the ground. I did not tell her about the legal inquiries. I would have saved her face at the cost of her lesson. and I was not sure that lesson was mine to give. Robert's letter had been explicit. Teach if you must, but do it with the dignity of a parent who loves. I had the support of paper and lawyer. I had the choice between spectacle and quiet correction. I chose quiet. There were times in those weeks when I was ashamed of the calculation. At night, I would sit in the armchair Robert had slept in when he had trouble breathing the last season, and I would speak aloud to him as if he could answer. "Do you think I'm right?" I'd ask. The stars sometimes felt like the kind of audience that does not judge too harshly. I felt the tug of my own motives, the mixture of righteous grief, and the desire for Angela to choose better. Love is not always soft. Sometimes it is a hard instrument used to remove the splinter. Angela took a job cleaning at a small nursing home down on Elm Street. It was honest work, dusty and steady, the kind of work where you scrub tile and learn to keep your hands in the middle of the day. She told me at first that she was only doing it until Edward sorted things out. The job turned into hours, and the hours turned into the small, steady competence of someone learning to be useful for its own sake. She came home smelling of floor cleaner and lemon and the kind of fatigue that settles into the shoulders with dignity. Neighborhood conversation changed. Aurora's tone softened into something like permission. "She seems different," Aurora said once, putting a slice of lemon tart across from me. "She looks tired, but she looks not desperate." The gossip quieted as people habitually do when the drama fails to deliver the weekly spectacle. Behind the scenes, Mr. Peterson moved like a gardener, pruning, not hacking. He gathered evidence that the sale of the beach house had relied on a forged signature and a questionable notarization. He found irregularities in the escrow account and a trail of wire transfers that were inconsistent with a legitimate closing. When he filed motions to freeze certain accounts and to contest the sale on grounds of fraud, I felt the world tightening into order beneath my feet. The court did what courts do. It took time, it required patience, it stumbled over procedure, but finally it found there was enough to suspect and to proceed. The morning of the hearing, I wore my wine-colored dress, the one Robert had bought me on our anniversary, and which still felt like an armor of good taste. Angela sat beside me in the gallery like someone peeled and raw. She had no makeup, and her hands trembled around a paper cup. She kept trying to meet my eyes and failing. I realized then how much of her idea of herself had been woven into the comfort she had sought. A borrowed apartment, a borrowed car, borrowed promises. As the judge read the findings that fraud had occurred and that the sale would be set aside pending further investigation, Angela let out a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. I could not immediately tell. When the legal dust settled, the deeds returned to our name, and the escrow funds were tied up in litigation, but crucially, the bank recognized a prior interest and could not legitimately transfer the beach house to a third party. Edward's name became a footnote in papers that weighed heavily with signatures. The formalities that had been used to steal were unknit when examined closely. I did not trumpet these things to Angela. The reveal I chose was quieter, and it perhaps reveals more of my character than would be comfortable. One afternoon, Mr. Peterson asked us to come to his office. I had already informed him that I would bring Angela. I had wanted her to see that the law could be the teacher. We sat together in a small conference room, sunlight setting like honey across the desk. Mr. Peterson placed a folder between us. Inside were documents, emails, bank statements, the notary's contradictory affidavit, and a small, plain photocopy of the forged signature. Angela held the copy with a face that had the clarity of someone finally seeing herself from the outside. "Why?" she began, her voice tiny. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I wanted you to see it," I said. "I wanted you to learn without the shielding that keeps a person from learning their own feet." She looked at me then as if I had become a stranger in the room. "You put me through this. You watched me fall." "I watched you choose," I corrected gently.
I watched you accept choices you made. You can be angry at me for not pulling you out at once. You can also admit that the world is harsher than a lecture and that your hands will remember a scrubbing brush more honestly than a credit line."
Her face crumpled. She cried then, quietly, the kind of grief that had only one adequate address. "I thought I was clever," she said. "I thought if I married him, life would be easier." "People promise ease," Mr. Peterson said, voice neutral. "They are persuasive when you are ready to be persuaded. The remedy cannot be immediate safety without learning. Otherwise, you simply place a bandage over a wound that demands care." Angela stayed employed at the nursing home. She paid for a portion of the legal fees she could manage from the small wages she accrued. She returned some trinkets that Edward had disguised as gifts. Mr. Peterson negotiated the repayment schedule in such a way that it required her to demonstrate responsibility. The law provided structure. The work provided the content of character. In the months that followed, the beach house returned to our dominion, and we decided together, after tearful and careful talk, that its purpose would be altered. I would not deny that a vindictive part of me had once entertained the idea of renting it out just to spite or profit. That was not the woman Robert knew. The woman he married had been given to small mercies and steady hands. So, slowly, we made plans to transform the house into a shelter for women moving out of abusive situations, and for those who had been ostracized by fortune or circumstance. It felt like Robert's quiet sense of thrift and providence finally stepping into the service of what mattered. Angela was not a willing partner at first. She bristled when I used the words foundation and shelter as if they were a rebuke. She had to carry boxes for thatched roofs and learn the modest economies of running a household with purpose. Over time, as she encountered the women who, in their modest ways, carried dignity despite bruised histories, she began to change. She listened to their stories and, in the telling, disentangled her own. She returned to school part-time for a social work certificate, a decision that surprised me with its steadiness. When she locked her head down to study, when she came home smelling like disinfectant and dinner and the clean exhaust of working machines, I felt something gentle thaw inside me. She began to speak about clients with a mixture of shock and pride. Mrs. Ellis, she told me one evening as we shelled peas on the porch, said she had never been really listened to until someone asked about her favorite color. Small things, yes, monumental in impact. People in the neighborhood began to perceive a subtle shift. The same gossip that had once been sharp with sympathy now hummed with a different note. Aurora watched me once, thoughtful, and then asked in a whisper that had the weight of curiosity and admiration, "Did you always plan this?" I laughed. If only life were so neat. She smiled and brought me homemade soup without comment. Edward faded from the story like a character in a book whose chapter has been closed. His legal troubles continued in the background, but he no longer had the music to draw Angela. She visited court hearings as an observer sometimes, not to watch him, but to learn how systems move. There was no revenge in what we did. The law took its course, and we let it. There were moments I doubted my choices. I had been chastised in private by friends who thought I had been cruel. Their scolding stung because in its essence, it asked whether I had the right to be the instrument of another's discomfort. I wrestled with that. In the quiet of my kitchen at night, I would think of Robert's letter, the blessing to be stubborn, and wonder if stubbornness alone was enough to be kind. But kindness alone without wisdom can become indulgence. There is a line between enabling and rescue, and one learns to walk on it like an old woman balancing a pan of cookies across a crowded table. At the center of all this, the old truck remained under its tarp. One afternoon, Angela found herself sitting on the tailgate, scratching at the rust with an old nail. "I always liked this truck," she said, surprise in her voice as if she'd just discovered a childhood relic. "Dad kept it like a promise." She sounded like a child remembering a lullaby. You can help me fix it, I said, not to drive off to Florida, but to learn how it runs. We worked together on that truck in the thin spring sunlight. She learned to change the oil, to recognize the sound a stubborn carburetor makes, to appreciate the slow rewards of repairing instead of replacing. There is dignity in fixing your life with your own hands. It was not a sentimental project, it was a literal and figurative reclaiming. When the house on the coast finally opened as the Mariner House, a place for women to stay, learn skills, and regain footing, we cut a modest ribbon, not because we wanted applause, but because a group of neighbors had come with casseroles and flowers and the quiet approval of people who had watched a small, honest transformation happen. Angela stood beside me with a clipboard, smiling and a little embarrassed by the attention. She greeted visitors and volunteers with a composure that had been earned by the months of scrubbing floors and listening to other people's grief. At night sometimes, I would sit on that beach house porch and speak to Robert in the way one addresses a companion across years. You were stubborn too, I'd tell him. The stars above the water felt like a private congregation. You tuck away things for later. You left me a key. You left me a reason. I would finger the dent in the skillet as if it were the last proof that the life we had made was still true. There are still wounds. Angela and I have conversations that reopen old hurts with bruises and apologies that need to be sincere to be helpful. She still sometimes slips into entitlement when she has a success. I correct her, gently but firmly. She reminds me sometimes how lonely it was in those days when she feared losing everything. I remind her how much she learned when stripped of pretense. The shelter runs by committee. We have meetings about budgets and laundry, about volunteers and privacy. It is work in the ordinary sense, and that ordinariness has become our ministry. Sometimes I think about providence. I could call it fate or luck, or the residue of a man who loved carefully. Robert had been meticulous in ways that infuriated me when we were young. Now I thanked him in the way people thank the world, by doing something useful with what had been left. I never believed in miracles the way church tracts describe them. I believed in small, human providences that arrive in a manila envelope, in a key, in the patience of lawyers, and in the willingness of a woman to work an honest shift. There are days when I sit in the kitchen with a cup of coffee and remember the waiting room and the way the phone had felt so small in my bag. I could have strode out then and taken my daughter's choices away, replaced them with cushions and cash. I could have been the kind of mother who polishes over fault with credit and cash. Instead, I chose a different path. One that required legal patience and moral suffering and the possibility of real transformation. That is not to boast. It is to say that some lessons require a parent's tough mercy. A year after the call, Angela stood on the Mariner House porch in the same place where I had once sat with Robert's letter. She had a social work cap in her hands and looked older in the way that comes from steady weather. I don't know if I can ever fully repay you, she said. Her voice was small. It was not an apology for all the ways she'd hurt me, but it was more than shadows. You don't owe me the life you thought you deserved, I replied. You owe it to yourself to be steady. She laughed, a sound with the edges sanded off. You were always more stubborn than you let on. I had a good teacher, I said, and I had a key. We both smiled at that, an almost private joke about inheritance indoors. At night on the porch at the beach house, I sometimes still talk to Robert about the small surprises of life, the way it twists, the unexpected kindness of strangers, the dignity found in a dish scrubbed clean. I thank him in silence for the envelope that asked me to be stubborn, and for the faith, not the religious kind, but the human one, that people can learn. I look at Angela as she signs intake forms for a new resident, and I feel an odd, welling satisfaction, not of triumph, but of repair. There are things I would do differently, mistakes I acknowledge. I tried to weigh sternness with mercy, and sometimes misjudge the balance.
but I learned that dignity is less about keeping the possessions life can take and more about keeping the habits life returns.
When a woman leaves the Mariner house with a bus ticket and a resume folded in her purse, with a small, honest sense of self, that is wealth beyond the deeds and the jewels. The truck is parked in front of the beach house now, its tarp removed, and a library of mismatched tools in its bed. Angela drives it sometimes to pick up supplies. Once, she took a girl from the shelter to a job interview and returned with a grin that made the porch seem like a small cathedral. I watched them go and thought of the peculiar arc of things, how a woman who once sold a house she did not own could, through work and humility, return to stewardship of a place filled with help for others. If you ask me what I learned in the clatter of legal forms and the hush of late-night confessions, I would say this: money is a tool, not a teacher. Suffering is not a virtue by itself, but when met with courage and guidance, it can refine character. And sometimes the right action is not simply to spare someone pain, but to put them in the hands of truth. Robert's envelope sits now in a small wooden box on my dresser, beside a photograph of him smiling at the edge of a pier. The brass key is polished and hangs on a hook. There is a peace that is neither loud nor flashy. It is the steady certainty of a life put back in order. I still go to the clinic for my checkups. The waiting room still smells faintly of lemon and coffee, and sometimes when the phone vibrates, my hand goes to it with a reflex from old anxieties. But if the phone rings now and Angela's name comes across, the sound feels different. It is less a command and more a conversation between two people who have learned to live within the true currency of their days. I have told this story because it marked a line between what I was and what I became. A woman who refused to be flattened by betrayal and who refused to fix another's life at the cost of their growth. If someone reads this and wonders whether such measures are right for them, I cannot say. I can only say what happened in this small life, that we turned a sail into a shelter, a fall into work, and a secret into a key for a better future. For all the messiness, there was restoration. There are more things to tell: the opening months of the shelter, the way neighbors learned to donate without pitying, the moment a woman named Lucia held my hand and called me Mama with a full heart. But those belong to another evening. For now, I fold the photograph of Robert into its place, the house on the shore glinting in my mind like something restored. If you stayed this far, thank you for listening. Your support helps stories like mine find ears. Please consider subscribing and sharing your thoughts below. Have you ever had to choose between immediate rescue and hard love? Leave a comment and tell me what you would have done. If these stories matter to you, a subscription and a like help keep them coming. Lucia liked to wake before anyone else. In the first months, she would slip from her cot with the furtive grace of someone who has learned to be invisible and make tea on the small stove we kept for those who could not stand the taste of the shelter's institutional coffee. She made it with bags of chamomile left over from a neighbor's donation, and she always left a cup on the windowsill for whoever woke next. Once, when I found her there in the blue light of morning, she had folded a scrap of fabric into a neat square and tucked it into the crack of the sill like a secret. "Why do you do that?" I asked, standing in the doorway with my hands full of stock sheets. She looked at me without surprise. "Because it is good to leave something for the next," she said. "It is a small practice. It keeps me remembering that I can give." That insistence on habit, on the tiny rituals that remake a person, became the heart work of the Mariner House. We taught sewing and budgeting and the slow art of taking a job that paid less than dignity but could be done with honesty. We taught how to show up on time and how to ask for help without pretending to be perfect. We learned to distinguish between rescue and rescue without repair. Giving a bed for one night and letting the old patterns run as if nothing had changed were two different things. We had to hold both the night's immediate safety and the longer arc of a life. The neighbors watched, first with wariness and then with curiosity. At first, they brought casseroles and plastic-wrapped desserts, the kind of charity that comforts the giver as much as the receiver. Then Mrs. Etta, a retired teacher who lived 2 doors down, walked into the kitchen with a box of mismatched mugs and a stack of linen napkins she had hemmed herself. "They were always on my table," she said, handing them across with a seriousness that made me sit down. "I want them used. No pity. Use them like you would use good things." "Why no pity?" Lucia asked, drying a pan with an almost reverent motion. Mrs. Etta smiled, the pupils of her eyes narrowing. "Because pity makes people small. Help that expects thanks makes the receiver feel owned. Give as if what you have is ordinary. Give as if you know you will one day need help too." She tapped the lid of her teacup and walked away, the napkins folded like a promise in her arms. Those small lessons changed the tone of donations. Neighbors began to leave tools and books not in plastic garbage bags, but arranged as gifts one could handle without humiliation. A carpenter donated a bench he had never finished. A teenage boy painted a wooden sign that read Mariner House in crooked but loving letters. People started to visit without ceremony, dropping off a dozen eggs, asking quietly about the day, staying long enough to hear a story and leave changed. Not all change was gentle. There were, inevitably, nights that tested everything we had decided to be. The rules: no guests in the kitchen after midnight, scheduled chores, mandatory meetings, were not designed to be punitive. They were scaffolding. But scaffolding must be sturdy, and sometimes it was met with resistance. One winter night, a woman named Mara burst through the front door carrying a smell of cold and fear. She had lived in the shelter for a while and had been taken in by a program that found her a temporary job and a small room above a bakery. That attempted steady life had lasted 3 months before a relapse in the old neighborhood, a confrontation with an old partner, an assault, a stolen paycheck. She had come back with tears that did not stop and a small backpack that contained a child's winter hat. "You can't let me back out there," she sobbed as Angela closed the door behind her. Please, I have no place else." The sympathetic muscles of the house wanted to fold instantly, to put a blanket round her shoulders, to feed her, to exclaim that of course she could stay. The sympathies were real and urgent and true, but there were other truths. Mara had left a trail of unpaid bills at the bakery. She had taken cash from a roommate's purse during a night of confusion, and the little room had been promised to another woman who was due to arrive in 3 days. We had made commitments. The shelter could not exist on promises alone. I remember the silence that came after her pleading, the way the kitchen light seemed to hang in the air like a coin. Angela held the strap of her bag as if anchoring herself. "We will do what is needed," she said quietly, "but returning is not the same as getting help. Do you want us to keep you safe, or do you want us to help you build a plan to go back out safe?" Mara's eyes, rimmed in red, searched the faces around her as if for permission to choose. "I want both," she whispered, which was both honest and impossible. We offered a third thing, a temporary place at the clinic's stabilization program, a space decided by the staff and by Mara together. She could have a place to sleep while agreeing to daily check-ins and a schedule that included counseling and the process of reparation at the bakery, returning the unpaid wages by working shifts, making amends to the roommate. Tough love, we called it among ourselves, but that phrase sounds harsher than it felt in the room. It was, rather, love that expected adulthood, which at times requires asking someone to show up for consequences. Mara chose the program. She came back to the house weeks later, not with a triumphant story, but with a letter in her hand. A letter from the bakery owner verifying she had made good on the debt, and a folded scrap of paper that said politely she would be welcome to reapply for work after 3 months. She sat on the porch with Lucia and watched the sea.
I learned my own edges, she said softly. I learned I could be trusted to fail and to try again. Trust, that was the other delicate currency we learned to manage.
We could not operate if every small break was treated as permanent betrayal, and yet we could not ignore patterns that endangered others. The balance tilted often, and sometimes it tilted wrong. There were staff arguments about when to enforce curfew strictly and when to bend it. There were nights a woman slipped out with a boyfriend and returned drunk and angry, and the next day the community would be bruised until tempers cooled and the work of repair began. In those squalls, the envelope from Robert was like a talisman. I would take it from the small box on my dresser and turn it between my hands. Its paper softened at the crease, the ink faint, reminding myself of the principle inside, not the specific instruction. The key on the hook below it was merely brass. The meaning of both was far larger. Robert had asked me to be stubborn in the face of pity that infantilizes and mercy that erases responsibility. It had felt once like a cruel test. In the grind of daily choices, it became a compass. A larger test came, not from within the house, but from the world outside. A columnist from a local paper wrote a piece with an attention that made the phone ring and the inbox fill with both praise and questions. The profile of the Mariner House was kind in tone, but sharp in curiosity. How we were funded, how we measured success, what criteria we used to decide who stayed and who must move on. For every note of gratitude, there was a query. Why was a woman turned away while a man was accepted? Why were background checks not more thorough? Was there not a better model that did not force people to choose between dignity and discipline? That piece opened doors. Some brought donations, others brought inspectors and bureaucrats with clipboards, and still others brought skeptics for whom any private solution was suspect. The shelter had to answer. We wrote our policies, we gathered statistics, we trained volunteers in the language of boundaries and in the soft sciences of trauma. We learned to document not as a way to prove we were right, but so that the work could be replicated and, where it failed, improved. There were meetings in the back room with coffee that tasted suspiciously of the same lemon-scented cleaner we used in the bathrooms. We argued about forms and about humanity. We fought over whether measurable outcomes could capture the quiet sea change of a woman who learned to save $1 a week. Sometimes these administrative fights felt as serious as the nights of crying and fever, because they shaped whether the shelter could continue. Angela was our unlikely point person with the wider world. The years of signing intake forms had given her a professional calm that hid a fierce protectiveness. I watched her meet with donors and city officials, her voice steady as if she had always been filing petitions and negotiating leases. When one funder offered a grant with strings that would have forced us to prioritize measurable employment quotas over holistic recovery, Angela refused with a clarity that surprised the funder and steadied the house. "We cannot measure the growth of a habit with one survey," she told him. "We can measure presence and we can measure participation. The rest is slow work." Not everyone applauded her courage. There were board meetings where the language of numbers drummed against our small table, and I would find myself defending the intangible, the steadying power of a woman who learned to iron her own shirt, the dignity in a resume that said "worked at bakery" without apology. I learned to translate those intangibles into reports, attendance percentages, hours of counseling, job retention rates, so that those who prized quarterly results could see the line and, perhaps, learn patience. Personal stories braided themselves into those reports. Lucia knitted a child's hat for a neighbor's newborn and refused to take payment, saying only that she wanted the baby to know warmth. Mrs. Etta continued to press cookies into the hands of women leaving the house with a bus ticket. A young man named Jonah, who had once been homeless himself, came to volunteer every Saturday to teach basic carpentry, saying he wanted to pass on skills he had been given. There were losses, too. A woman named Simone, brittle with grief and old with the kind of sorrow that had nothing to do with years, left the house for a subsidized apartment and then died alone in that small space shortly afterward. We learned that shelter cannot always be a remedy for every wound. Sometimes it is a companion to a slow end. We held a quiet wake in the kitchen where the kettle hummed and someone read a poem poorly, and we set a chair at the table with Simone's scarf on it. We learned to grieve without letting grief harden into paralysis. And there were unexpected returns. Months after leaving with a bus ticket and a new small confidence, Lucia came back to show us a photograph. She had taken a job at a sewing cooperative and had been asked to make patterns for a small line of children's clothes. Her face in the picture was sunlit and surprised, and she had written on the back, "For the house, for the practice." We pinned that photograph on the corkboard above the counter where volunteers could see it when they came to log in. It was a small thing, a paper testament to habit made real, a woman who had learned to leave something for the next. Evenings found me back on the porch with a book I rarely finished, listening to the house settle. The ocean made its distant sound like a machine for remembering. Travelers would pass along the shore, couples with dogs, teenagers with soda cans, and sometimes a woman who had once lived at the Mariner House would stand and wave from a distance. Those waves could be brief and clinical, or wide and grateful. Both kinds taught me different things about getting well. There remained the practicalities that make any small institution clatter. The alternation of donors and bills, the slow parade of background checks, the nights when the generator refused to start and someone had to walk to the corner shop for batteries. I kept the envelope from Robert on my dresser like an older truth that did not need constant rereading. The key hung below it like a wink. One afternoon, as summer leaned into September, a letter arrived, handwritten and folded twice. Inside was an invitation. The city wanted to honor the Mariner House at an upcoming community event, to present a plaque and say a few words about neighborhood service. We all felt the odd flush of embarrassment that comes with being singled out. Pride and discomfort mingled. The plaque felt like a public way to say that the thing we had made, small, messy, human, was doing some good. At the event, standing in a small field where folding chairs creaked and children ran between them, Angela accepted the plaque in a simple speech that said little about us and much about the women who had shaped the work. "We did not start as experts," she said. "We began as neighbors. We learned. We continue to learn." People clapped, some with hands softened by tears. Mrs. Etta came up to me afterward and took my hand as if passing a relay baton. "You didn't do it alone," she said, and I knew she was right in more ways than one. There were seasons when the shelter hummed like a living thing, and seasons when it strained. Through it all, the principle that had come to me in the envelope, stubbornness for the sake of growth, proved less like an inflexible rule and more like a patient gardener's hand. We pruned where necessary. We sheltered tender shoots from the wind. We let some vines run their course. The work of restoration, I learned, is more about tending than triumph. On nights when the work was heavy, when reports were due and funds were thin, I would stand alone at the edge of the porch and listen. The Mariner in Robert's photograph seemed to smile with the secret of someone who understood the tides. I touched the key on my dresser and felt its simple weight. There was no grand ending to the story, no final clean sweep that made everything perfect. There were only evenings like this one, quiet, gathered, full of small continuities. I have told some of these tales because they remind me that a life can be rebuilt not only by big gestures, but by the accumulation of small courtesies and firm discipline. The house stays open because of people who show up to sweep, to teach, to bake,
because neighbors bring their best plates and refuse to pity, because sometimes a woman chooses a program that asks more of her than the easy path.
The envelope and the key remain on my dresser, not as relics of a singular decision, but as reminders of the temperament the work requires, stubbornness paired with humility. If you ask me whether every choice we made was the correct one, I will say no. I will tell you about nights of regret and mornings of second chances. But if you ask whether the small life we tended was worth the stubbornness, I will answer yes. There is a dignity in a life that learns the habits of repair, and there is a quiet joy in watching someone leave the house with a bus ticket, a folded resume, and a habit of leaving a cup of tea for the next person. The truck is still parked in front of the beach house some days, its bed full of reclaimed wood and donations. Angela still drives it when she needs fresh linens or tools. Lucia keeps her teapot on the sill. Mrs. Etta brings napkins and insists we use them. Mara writes from time to time and tells us of small victories and strange defeats. Simone's chair remains at the kitchen table, a place set and not forgotten. There is more to tell about a young mother who learned to read, about Jonah's first commissioned bench, about a winter when the heat went out and the community pooled blankets. But those are stories for nights when the porch is full and the kettle is steady. For now, the house breathes, the sea moves on its slow business, and I fold my own habits into place. If you stay long enough in any small work, you come to understand that repair is less a project than a practice. It asks for stubbornness, yes, but also for the patience to accept that some things cannot be rushed. I have learned to hold both my heart and my hands open, firm when firmness is needed, gentle when gentleness will teach. The envelope is not instruction so much as reminder. The key is not a secret so much as an emblem. We keep them both close because they remind us how to live. Outside, a dog barks somewhere down the lane. Inside, somewhere, the kettle hums, and the ledger waits for tomorrow's tally. I close my book, stand, and go to the window. The sea is a hard silver band in the distance. The house lights flicker one by one. There is still work to be done, and that is a comfort.